The largest recorded extinction occurred near the end of the Permian period, and this is the third mass extinction, sort of. And this happened about 250 million years ago, the late Permian. So this extinction resulted in 80 to 85% of all species to die out. There is no evidence that what happened was that an impact occurred during the extinction's duration, which lasted about 7 million years. But it's believed that other factors probably also contributed to the disappearance of such a great number of species as well. The span of time during which the extinction happened, those 7 million years, also corresponds to the eruption of massive Siberian flood basalts, or again, that large igneous province that I was referring to earlier, the Siberian Traps. And this is in Russia. And again, this probably also resulted in the release of a large amount of greenhouse gases, and hence it contributed to climate change quite aggressively. So it's believed again that an impact did aid towards the extinction during those 7 million years, but a great amount of it was caused by the Siberian Traps greenhouse gas release, and hence the change of climate. On top of those two events, the assemblage of the supercontinent Pangaea, again, which happened at about 250 million years ago, would have also dramatically reduced the area of shallow marine environment. So if you think of Pangaea as a supercontinent, you will no longer have as much coastline as you did when continents were not together, were spread apart, right? And so with this reduction in coastline, it also reduced dramatically the area for shallow marine environments and the area for the species that lived in these environments to continue living, which at the time was a great number of the species, and it still kind of is. And so this particular extinction encompasses the three major ways in which you can get climate change, or at least mass extinction to occur due to climate related things. So it had plate tectonics in motion, right, making Pangaea. It had the Siberian Traps, so a lot of volcanic eruptions. And again, it's speculated that an impact also aided in the changing environment. The fourth mass extinction happened at the end of the Triassic period, which was about 202 million years ago. So this one seems to be linked to volcanic activity and subsequent climate change due to that volcanic activity. So large amounts of greenhouse gases were released with the volcanic eruptions that occurred at spreading centers. And these spreading centers were caused by the splitting up of the supercontinent Pangaea. So Pangaea, about 200 million years ago, started splitting. And so by that splitting, when you have plate motions in the spreading centers, you're going to have a continual rise of magma at those divergent plate boundaries. And so it was this volcanic eruption of magma, or of lava, that created the subsequent warming of climate change there in the late Triassic period by the breaking up of Pangaea, which is really cool. It is calculated that the global temperature, which before the extinction was already 3 degrees Celsius higher than it is today, rose another 3 to 4 degrees Celsius during that extensive volcanic activity. So it ended up being 6 to 7 degrees Celsius higher in average than the temperature that we have today in the planet. So that is believed to have been the greatest amount of volcanic activity that this planet probably has ever seen in a specific time period. So definitely would not have wanted to be there at the time. And this extinction resulted in half of all genera of marine animals to become extinct. So you see that the dip here is probably not 50%, but it resulted in 50% of the marine animals to become extinct. The fifth mass extinction happened at the end of the Cretaceous period. Perhaps again, this is the extinction that you may be more familiar with, as it resulted in the extinction of most dinosaurs. This boundary right here between the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic era is referred to as the KT boundary. Your book refers to it as the KPG boundary. So K is the symbol that we use for Cretaceous, and T for Tertiary, which is a subdivision within the Cenozoic era. Your book uses PG because PG stands for Paleogene, which is the official period that follows the Cretaceous period. So that is that boundary right there. And you will probably hear of it eventually in your life, perhaps at a museum or something like that, if you don't go into geology or paleontology. So this event was rather sudden, and it seems to have been caused by the impact of a giant asteroid, as I said a little bit ago. This giant asteroid was about 10 kilometers in diameter, so 10 kilometers is about 6 miles in diameter. So you can just think of a body of 6 miles, circular basically. Think of it as a circular body 6 miles in diameter, or in length, that blasted at a very rapid speed into the Yucatan Peninsula, which is in the northern, or I guess the tip of the northern eastmost part of Mexico. And I'll show you that in the map in a little bit. So again, this extinction brought the end of most large dinosaurs, which had been on top of the food chain for over 100 million years, or more even by that time. So the extinction of these large dinosaurs, however, allowed for small mammals to diversify and evolve into the approximately 4,000 species, which include humans, that are alive today. So not all bad news. It was really devastating back then, but it allowed for mammals to diversify, as well as other species in the oceans and on land, aside from mammals like birds and fish and other reptiles or amphibians even, to diversify along with mammals. So it wasn't all bad. So as you may notice, this is almost exactly the same slide as the one before. Here we're going to go in a little bit of depth about that KT or KPG boundary extinction. So pages 573 to 576 of your book tell the story of how this KT boundary was found and what it meant. It's a story basically of scientific questioning, of scientific collaboration, and of findings that I think is worth the read if you're curious. So the main takeaway points from that discussion that they go into in your book is that based on the amount of iridium, which is an element commonly found in extraterrestrial bodies, again that's iridium, based on the amount that was found of that element and the boundary between Cretaceous and Paleogene rocks, they were able to relate the extinction that happened to an impact. So because they saw more iridium right at the boundary between Cretaceous rocks and Paleogene rocks, they basically were able to say, okay, if this extinction happened at this boundary and I find this amount of iridium in it, that means that the amount of iridium must have been brought by an impact. So the impact must have had an effect, at the very least, onto this extinction. So once they found a possible crater that happened to be in the northern Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, so here in the map you have North America, this is Florida right here, and you have Mexico right here. So Mexico extends downward and kind of takes this little dip towards the east. That's the Yucatan Peninsula. So the crater for that impact is towards the western northern tip of the Yucatan Peninsula itself. So once they found that possible crater, as well as geologic structures that depicted the rims of that crater in that area, some of those geologic structure examples are the cenotes, or that's how the Mayan people call them, or sinkholes that were found in those Mayan lands, as well as metamorphosed rocks that were caused by shock metamorphism, as the impact, landed and it shocked those rocks and made them metamorphose. And also some of the impact breccia that got buried beneath. Then after they found all these structures, they were able to point out or why such an impact had the type of effect that it did on the species on our planet. So again, once they found the place and they found those geologic structures, the sinkholes, the shock metamorphism, the impact breccia, they were able to pinpoint why such an impact of that magnitude could have had the effect that it did on our species, or on the species of the planet. So the asteroid itself was about 10 kilometers in diameter, which is about the altitude at which jet airlines fly. So you can think of, a body that lies between the surface of the Earth till where the airplanes fly. That's how big it was. And that's just in length. It was like a circular thing, a massive thing. And it entered the atmosphere traveling about 30 kilometers per second. So incredibly fast. 30 kilometers per second is 20 miles per second. So the blast itself is calculated to have released about 100 million megatons, which is roughly about 10,000 times as great as the entire nuclear arsenal that we have in the world right now. 10,000 times as much. So the crater that this impact formed is now covered by sediment, but when it was formed, it's estimated to have been about 200 kilometers in diameter and about 40 kilometers in depth. So again, if 10 kilometers is from the surface to how far jet airplanes fly, you can picture 40 kilometers as being 4 times that. That's how deep the crater was upon impact. That's insane. So that also gives you a perspective of, in 65 million years, all of those 40 kilometers have been buried, basically, by further sediment. So after the impact, there followed a set of shock and heat waves that radiated outwards from the impact site. So those heat waves, and that's shown right here. So those heat waves probably caused the ignition of many forest fires, and that is shown in this image right here. So you have a bunch of fires going on. And then a giant cloud of vaporized rock and gases that was produced as a huge fireball rose up and formed a huge mushroom cloud. And that's what you're seeing right here. A little bit here and much more right here. So much of the materials that make up that cloud were made from gypsum rocks. So gypsum contains sulfur. So a fair amount of sulfur dioxide was also released. So at the impact, heat and energy made those rocks vaporize or pulverize. And so much of that sulfur that the gypsum rocks had was released. And as we know, the sulfur, this compound, as it reacted with the vaporized water, of which there was plenty in the atmosphere, caused sulfuric acid to be made. The sulfuric acid, once it precipitated as the rain fell, it became acid rain, and for what was probably a long period of time, it fell on the surface. And this sulfuric acid actually poisoned much of the fresh water. Sulfuric acid is poisonous to most species, animal species, and certainly, plant species as well. So it probably killed much of the vegetation in the area where it fell, and it killed a lot of the fresh water that the animals needed to drink, or even the vegetation that they needed to eat, hence destroying much of life with that falling of sulfuric acid.